Hi, everybody. Welcome. Just a couple pieces of, Zoom should be able to hear me. Hopefully you all can hear me projecting if these aren't working too well. Couple orders of business. First, if you need to log into Slido, the codes are posted up on these walls to either side of you. And for people on Zoom, if you have any questions for our speaker today, you can put those in the chat and we'll do our best to get to those in the short Q&A time we have at the end. This is our final installment for the semester for speaker series, and I think it's been a really awesome one. It definitely takes a lot of people, more than you see sort of milling about up here every time. I'd just like to take a quick opportunity to thank them. Today I'll do one in particular, which is Julie Coleman. She has been the student leader of this program now for a while, and unfortunately she couldn't be here today because she's a little under the weather. But it's a little bittersweet because this is her last event that she'll be doing, and I'll be taking over next semester. But I would like to just recognize her work before she graduates. So if we could just give her a quick round of applause. Thank you, Julie. Hopefully you're watching or resting or both. One quick thing I'll say is I think it's really easy to overlook or undervalue what's right in front of you when we're looking for insight or enlightenment. And today, our speaker, who I'm not going to introduce, but I'll just say one quick thing. Our speaker is one of our own from our faculty. And I think his work is really important to our department, and even self-admittedly says he's not a designer, at least in the traditional sense. Yet his work is essential, like vital to what we do. So I'm really excited about today. I'm going to introduce another great faculty member of ours who will introduce him. And that's Carlos Licon, Dr. Carlos Licon. Carlos, I've never called you doctor before. I know, it's true. Doctor, speaker, and Dr. Licon. Carlos has a PhD in environmental planning and design. Okay, good. And a master's degree in environmental planning as well. He also has a bachelor's degree in architecture, the dark side. And he's been a teacher here for a while now. I actually don't know how long. How long have you been here? 13 years. Taught several different classes. I'm in one of them now, bioregional analysis and planning. He does land use planning for residential design, urban planning and design, among many others. And I also want to knight him right now as the best whiteboard handwriting in the department, which is a coveted position in a design department. And I get to decide because I have the microphone. But without further ado, let's bring Carlos up to introduce our speaker. Round of applause. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. And I'm very happy to be here to introduce Dr. Chamberlain. I think having a colleague presenting in the speaker series is quite a recognition of how much we, your colleagues, appreciate and value your talent, your work, and your knowledge, as both as an educator and as a researcher. So let me say a few words about him. Dr. Chamberlain he's an associate professor in our department. He's been a faculty in also in Kansas State University and a scholar in UBC, University of British Columbia. He has degrees in business administration, which is strange that you are here after that, computer science and forestry. As you know, his expertise are in visualization, in spatial data, in applied computational approaches, and in environmental perception, and effect. Did I read everything correctly? So I have a lot of things to say about him, but we can summarize by saying that he's very active, very engaged. And another reason for having him here is to give all of you the opportunity to learn what he does, because not always we have that benefit. So he is certainly an important and a loud voice in our department. And if your office is next to him, he's very loud with the door closed and the music on. So I can read his vita, but it's better if we listen from him. So welcome, and wonderful to have you here. This is actually his.
That's the, thank you. You could have a long fire with that. All right, I think everyone can hear. Thank you very much, Carlos. Thank you everyone for being here. I really appreciate the audience, whether you're required to be here or you're just really intrigued about what the heck statistics and inference means in relationship to designing. Part of my hope for this presentation is really to help you all think more about the biases, the context in which you do design, and how you use evidence in decision-making and in the design process. So I'm not going to be talking about the design process particularly. You will hear that a lot, and I know you already have, but I'm going to drill down to a few more kind of elemental components of the way in which we think and how we use information. I'll start out by saying, if you're interested in any reading, here are 10 good books that I happened to read this summer. And I usually don't do that much reading this summer, but I was on a bike for a long time doing a lot of training. And these books have been quite influential in helping me rethink how I do research, how I do life. And a few of the ones that I'm going to be kind of referring to here, Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast, Slow. I do reference some of Adam Grant's work. Charles Duhigg has, I really also have enjoyed that book. But all of these have been somewhat influential in one way or another. So interesting reads for those of you who are interested. Part of the outline of today is kind of go through some of the foundations of what it means to be a statistical inferential person, designer, thinker, and then at least talk about this word probability. If that seems really scary, just think of the word probably, right? I'll probably do this. And then we can at least start from there, okay? And then just to give you a few examples of some of the research that I've done with colleagues that aim to help improve design and planning through evidence. And then we'll kind of cycle back through those things and the biases and foundations that we have on thinking. Okay, so let's start with foundations. We've got the Menti piece up there. Okay, for those who are listening on Zoom, that information is in the chat. We're going to try a little experiment. All right, here is the problem. I want you to read that problem and then I will respond a little bit. So Main Street, this is the hypothetical. Main Street in Howard City, USA was developed in 1924. It was created by engineers and architects with a focus on pedestrians and carts, but has been maintained and updated to stay modern. Recent updates have increased the sustainability of the roadway and sidewalks along businesses. It remains a hub of social and economic activity and is a key destination for a large number of tourists to the city. Which is more probable? That Main Street is beautiful, or Main Street is beautiful and is with tree-lined streets? All right. Pretty much, we're getting on. I've never done this, so we'll see. Okay, got the answers in? Answers in, answers in. Okay, well, here we go. Here we go. See if we can do it. All right. Actually, one of the options is correct. I don't know why it did that. Okay. We're going to do another one. I'm not going to tell you what the option is. Okay. Next question. This is the question that really was influential in developing a new theory. Okay. Linda is 31 years old. She's single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with the issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. This was a while back. Which is more probable? Linda is a bank teller, or Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement? All right. I'll tell you the correct one. I don't know if it will get me to the leaderboard here. Let's see. Okay. So the correct answer is that more probable, Linda is a bank teller, Main Street is beautiful. Why is it not the other one? Why is that? The word and. That's right. It's a conjunction, the conjunction fallacy. Okay. Those of you that answered, most answered the other way. That's actually how humans tend to respond to this kind of information. Main Street can be beautiful without tree-lined streets. It's not necessary. It is not, by adding trees, it doesn't make it any more probable because it already is beautiful, isn't it? Okay. Think about that when you see some design somewhere and this. And the reason, one of the other sort of components, it's helpful to understand this, is, or to make sense of this, is called Occam's Razor. So Occam was a priest a very long time ago, priest and scholar a long time ago, that sort of developed this concept. When faced with two possible explanations, the simpler of the two is most likely to be true. We've often heard it like the simpler model is the most accurate, sort of a little out of play, but that's otherwise. But this is also, for professors, this is also very true. Okay. We want to make sure that we're actually making you do the more complicated thing. Okay. Now, that can also be useful because what does it actually take to understand how something simply works if you're terribly misguided? So if we just make it really, really complex, then you learn all these other kinds of things that you shouldn't have learned or should have learned. But the concept of Occam's Razor is to really think about the way in which we look at models of how we pursue life, models of why we chose the degree that we did, the mate that we have, whatever it might be, right? This idea of saying the way in which we approach it, the simpler is often the most true. As I get more precise, I may be heading in the wrong way. So it's really important to understand, as I'm taking a design approach early on, look for accuracy first. Improve that iteratively. Make sure you go back, that you haven't lost that accuracy. Because otherwise we become so locked into that precision of one particular approach or one particular design, we may have actually lost the larger context, the truer approach to it. So here's a little project. I'll talk about this a little bit later. So this is a drive, Morrow Street in downtown Manhattan, Kansas, right next to Kansas State University. And what we're interested in doing is to come up with different designs. Okay. So this is another question. Get your phone ready. I'm going to ask you which of these following designs is more attractive. Now, you don't have any context of space. I know that, and that's very valuable. But at a simple level, I think you can probably come up with a decision or an answer. All right. Okay, there's our leaderboard, I guess. I don't know how this leaderboard works. Okay, 3 of 5. There we go. Which design do you perceive as being safer? Design A was the one on the left that had the bioswale and trees, pedestrian only. Design B was the one that had a road without parking. All right. Design A is being safer. Okay. Next one. Now we're going to move on to which one is more attractive. All right. Design A is both safer and more attractive, according to our expert panel. All right. Did anybody get that wrong? Okay. Anyone else? Did anyone answer A twice? Who answered A twice? Are any of you wrong?
Maybe any difference between one is pedestrian and one is actually with the car driving?
Yes, it just as it is. Yeah, we do have some other ones. But for these two, those of you that answered AA are also wrong. Oh my gosh, how is that possible? Anyone know how that might be possible? Okay, so one, you didn't know the scale of the data, did you? Two, you don't actually know if they are statistically different. Okay? These are statistically the same numbers in terms of attraction. When you look at the variation of responses and attractiveness, that's just the average. When I only ask 30 or 40 people which is most attractive, I can't be confident that A is always going to show to be more attractive. Averages do not necessarily mean that that one is right and that one is wrong. We have to understand how to make inference of the data. Really, really helpful. Because you will see these kind of data all the time, and you'll start making decisions and assumptions that will influence the way you think about that. Okay? Safety, that one was statistically significant. It was considered much safer. Scale being from 1 to 7, 7 being higher. All right? Okay. Next one. We've got a bunch of circles, okay? I'm going to ask, this is sort of the final question here. Let's see. Our leaderboard clearly is not working. That's good. Question 5, here we go. So remember those 3 circles. Which design, A, B, C to the right, dark blue circle at 5% of the area of the light blue circle? I gave you 3, A, B, and C. A was the largest, C was the smallest. All right. Okay. There are 2 different things that are happening here. One, we have a bunch of designers, people that are trained to understand form and shape. And most of you got it wrong. Second, there's also something called the anchoring effect. Anyone bought a used car before? Right? Somebody gives you a value and a price. That has, just by them mentioning that, has anchored what you believe that car might be worth. You have to go out and get additional evidence to make a better guesstimate of what that person will actually sell the car for. I anchored you by putting a larger circle on the left and the smallest one on the right, where 5% seems like it's really small. I don't know if anyone got all of those answers correct. If you did, well done. Good guesswork. Okay? But all I've shown you is just really simple, like really simple shapes, really simple questions, and a couple examples of pictures that seem like they were in design base so obvious. And yet they're not. Okay? So my hope is that this will give you a little context of how our brains are often very biased towards what we do. Daniel Kahneman, that thinking fast, thinking slow, Nobel laureate in economics, he's actually a psychologist, has coined this term. If we think about this as the size of our brain, the larger piece, how much time do we spend in what he refers to as system 1 versus system 2? He did this work with some others as well. Okay. 95%, I'm just going to give a generalization. The vast amount of our processing happens in system 1. Our brain does not want to do hard work. We avoid it. We avoid cognitive strain all the time. Okay? We avoid rational thinking, numeracy, doing things with numbers, right? We don't want to do that. We want to come up with a quick decision and move on. Okay? What you just did by rating was this. And most of you got a lot of them wrong. I would have gotten a lot of them wrong as well. Had I given you more time and said you've got 10 minutes, maybe you've gotten more of them right, but you probably could make an assumption, perhaps not, unless you came up with a way to objectively measure those things and really think through it critically, right? When you are posed with a design problem, we often jump into this. Most of our decision-making is here, and this is really prone to errors, okay? So we think about doing design or life in general. If we recognize those particular elements of the way that we think and the biases we have, that can be really helpful. It's not meant to second guess ourselves, but to understand the processes that are involved in the way that we make decisions. All right, so that scare you enough already? Then let's go into probability. Okay, so how do we use probability to make inferences and affect our beliefs? Okay, deck of cards. 52, there's no tricks here, it's just a deck of cards, okay? If I wanted to select a number, if I wanted to pull a card out of the deck, okay, and I want to be a 7 or lower, there's the probability. I'm telling you that is the probability. I rounded up, it's like 53.846 something or other, okay? This is close enough. All right, do you all have that in mind? That's the probability, okay? I'm going to ask, what's the probability if I shuffle a deck, brand new deck, randomly, I select a card? What's the probability? Is it 53.9? Yeah, do you think I'm tricking you?
Yeah.
I have to be. Okay, all right. We get a 5. Okay. I'm shuffling the deck again. Put the 5 back in. I shuffled it a lot. Or I put it through one of those casino randomizers, perhaps. But in any case, I shuffled a lot. Okay? What's the probability? How many of you say 53.9? Wow. Okay. Who says it's higher than that? Who says it's lower than that? Okay, what I should have done is actually made you all place a bet and make it give you $1 so I'd get more hands going up. Okay. Okay, I get a 3. What if I do it again? Is it the same probability, 53.9? Or is it different? I'm randomly shuffling those. It's 4. All right. What's next? There's the next one. How many of you fundamentally believed that the entire time the probability was 53.9? Okay. Frequentists. The others are Bayes. Okay, we'll talk about this. We talked about this today. Phil and I have been talking a bit about this. Okay. If it is random, it should never change. It's 53.9. But as you got new evidence for the card that I selected, you started asking questions. Is there something you're doing? Right? Is there something going on? Okay. It might be. But if you changed your mind about it, you could be swayed because the probability never changed unless I was doing something out of the norm. Okay. All right. So here we go. For those of you that said it's always the same, there you are. Now, I did not take the test on this or didn't have you add to it because there are different frames of reference for this. Okay, this other one could be indicative of what somebody who follows what's like referred to as a Bayesian or a subjective approach. Okay, meaning you have a belief. All of you started assuming it was probably 53.9, but really wondering, what is he doing to us? Okay, but probably that would have been your closest best guess. When that card changed, if you were somebody who's like, maybe something's going on, maybe I'll give it another try. Maybe it's actually a little bit higher. But then I did it again. You're like, maybe there's a pattern. Now it's much higher. By the time I guess on this one, I'm like, oh no, 70%, I'm going to keep going. This is like infamous in terms of roulette, right? That number's hot. Have you heard that before? Like James Bond walks in, is like, oh yeah, 3. I'm going to do another 3. There is no difference in probability unless somebody tweaked the board. Okay. But we say, oh yeah, that number's hot in a game like that, even though the probability never changes. A designer who seems to be hot, they're designing all these great things. Is that because there's some pattern of what that designer is doing? Or is it really some random event? Okay. But if you're following that expert thinking what they're doing is what's happening, you could be swayed in this way. I'm not saying either one's wrong. Here's another one. This is basically just random. Okay. I'm walking in and I'm just going to say, oh, I've got this random value and this random value, and I'm just thinking it's going to change. Because the first one is, oh yeah, 54, that was pretty close. Once I saw 3, I'm like, the probability might go down a little bit. Okay. Oh, you selected another low number. Well, the probability is probably higher. Okay. If you have kids or want to have kids someday and your first child is a girl, does it change what the probability is for the next one? No. Okay. But you might think that it might. It does not fundamentally change that. Okay. And there's another variation here. When you just fundamentally believe that I put something up there to trick you and you're like, no, he's doing something wrong. And I'm just going to hold on to this because I believe that this is right. Okay. So we have random and fallacy. Probability is the probability. If you hold true to a particular belief, knowing there's so much evidence that suggests otherwise, it's probably worth considering the role of that evidence. Okay? The illusion of validity. I think that I am valid because I have this great design and I think it's just right. And I did it and I did it well and I did it again and I did it again. And I'm just going to hold because I am so right. And someday I'm going to get an award for my design because I am so right. You have not absorbed any new information to at least reflect on what you do in your practice. It doesn't necessarily mean you're wrong, but it is dangerous not to consider additional evidence. So what does this have to do? Okay, I use the terms a little bit, the objectivist view or frequentist. If evidence shows that specific design principles, for instance, of form or function or beauty, outperform other variation, other principles, for instance, then I would take the former because in the long run, it should happen. The 53.9 or 53.9%. Eventually, if I do it again and again and again and again, the probability will be 53.9. Okay. You only have so long to live and only so many designs to do. So you don't always have the benefit of the long run. But that's part of the concept. Where the subjectivists will look at it and say, if I absorb the experience of experts and what I know, as well as I take on new evidence, that provides a basis for better outcome. Then the principles, then those principles from the experts plus that evidence will outperform better in the long run. Do you see how there's a subtle difference between the two? This one at the top will basically say, if I have new evidence, that's what I'm deciding to do. Okay, to some extent. Obviously, I'm making this a little simplified, but it helps us think in these models. Or this one is, I believe this, I've seen this, or these people tell me that. I'm going to start there. If I see evidence to the contrary, I might move a little bit more towards that. Okay. So which landscape architect's most likely to follow? Just think about in your own process, how does this work for you? Okay. Be aware, who are the experts? Who are guiding you? Who are forming that original knowledge? Most of us have some development as children. There are things that we absorb and use that we believe to be true, as we were told. And as we get older, we absorb new information, new evidence, new knowledge. And do we update our beliefs based on that? Do we critically think back where we were? Or, oh, we believe this new evidence is here. Was that done well? So understanding both the context of who the expert is and who evidence is, particularly is useful because most of us probably use this kind of approach. All right, so there was an example I wanted to come up with here. Ohio Bundy Triangle Park in Los Angeles. I'm not going to go through any of the designs, but what I could effectively do if I was a frequentist, okay, I would come up and I would say, here are my 4 designs. I'm now going to run an experiment. Those are my 4 designs. And we're going to basically do the selection of option A, B, C, or D. Whatever is statistically significant or outperforms the other is the one that we'll choose. That's how an objectivist would pursue that. Okay? The subjectivist, on the other hand, would say, gosh, I've lived a long life. I've designed these things. Yeah, we'll go out and talk to some people. We can run that same study. And I believe that option D is the best, but when option A comes back and says that is statistically far outperforming option D, and yet I still go select option D, it's because there wasn't enough evidence to suggest that my background belief and the way I've designed things before would allow me to shift away from option D. Does that make sense? If we're aware of how we absorb information and how we make decisions, particularly within the realm of biases, it's helpful to seek out additional knowledge or evidence to say, why am I doing this? Was my study not incorrect because I didn't give people enough context to say why I think this one would be good? Or am I already making an assumption because I believe something? So yeah, we'll just run the study to appease whoever it is because they need stakeholders, and we'll run it anyway, but we're still going to choose that. Okay. So here's kind of how it looks. Anybody remember the bell curve in statistics? I hope some head nods. And for those of you online, go to your computer really quick and look up bell curve. Okay. So some context. Let's just say here's another design, and I can go through and I can say, most people would believe that this is the quality of design. It's a little bit low. I'm not determining whether it's low or high. It was just a Creative Commons picture I could put up here because I haven't done any of these myself. Okay. So let's just say that's lower. Now I go out and run some empirical study and it says, to the contrary, it's actually a bit higher than what I thought it was. Somebody who follows a Bayesian sort of approach, let's say I'm going to update my priori beliefs were at one place. I have evidence that says I'm over here. So I'm going to kind of shift posterior, like post that experiment, a little bit more towards with that evidence. But I'm not going to take that evidence totally in full as truth. Okay? This gets a little bit tricky when we run some study in some way that ends up being bad evidence. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard all kinds of different things on social media or otherwise about the COVID vaccine. I mean, there's a lot of evidence out there. Some of it is better than others. And the question is, if we're taking it as a subjectivist approach and we started in one place and the evidence that we absorb shifts us towards one direction, gosh, I mean, if we're Bayesian, maybe it shifts us a little bit and we're like, feeling like we're a ball in a pinball machine constantly going back and forth, which I'm sure many of you have felt like. And if we're a frequentist, we might just jump from one side of the fence to the other really quick. I'm not suggesting that any one of these is the best approach. But if you understand the differences, you'll at least be aware of some of the biases that you might hold in the way that you're approaching what good design is. Okay, let's get to a few little examples. Any questions so far? Mm-hmm.
When you're talking about evidence and new evidence, what kind of information are you looking at? And when you're talking also about evidence, are you talking about criteria or program that could be done when you do the design? What's considered? So when we talk about good design, so there's a basis.
Yeah.
you know, if we ask students, if we do like, okay, you got a program, and then you got, so what is that relationship, evidence versus criteria?
Okay, so those of you who are online, if I can kind of summarize, it's like, what is the basis for evidence? And what are criteria that go into helping us understand that evidence or creating that evidence? So I think there are a couple of things. One of them is like, what is evidence? What kind of data exists, right? So I've shown you some probability models in which we can run studies, right? Option A versus option B. That would be one kind of sort of empirical evidence. Another would be suggestive, where you say, you know what, there was this design that somebody did 20 years ago, and let's look at how that's being used in the interaction between these different elements. That's useful evidence as well, okay? There's a challenge to that. And this is a great question as I sort of segue in here. One of the challenges to that is that in design, it is very, very difficult to be a frequentist. Case in point, I can ask, which of these designs do you prefer? But let's be honest, is the preference of the local community better than if I could actually build all four of these in exactly the same context at different random times and then make those performance assessments to see how people actually used it? Like, that is a lot better way of doing it, right? Why don't we do that? Yeah, okay. Fundamentally, it's expensive, okay? And also there's another thing. If I test option A first, and then test option B second, and option C third, and option D, that might be very different than testing option D first, and then C, and then A, and then B. Okay, the time in which we experience things has an effect, right? I might have different perceptions about my first child than my second child if they were reverse birth order. I can't change that. I can't go back and like restudy that, right? Design is in a continuous state of change in time. It makes it really difficult to like do these full-on empirical tests that we'd really want to do. It's really, really hard, nearly impossible because of the resources and the context. Yeah.
Another question, I'm sorry, I will stop after. But looking at these four options, I will not have enough evidence to judge them because I will not have enough context.
Yeah, exactly. So context, like all those things become so important in how we construct a model. So this, I think this is great. It'll get into some of this next piece. So I'll give you some indications of what I do, okay? Now, I have approached this research in more of a frequentist perspective, okay? One of the limits of what I do is that I can't test the mass wealth of possibilities. You can rate how comfortable this space feels. I could come back through and change all these tiles and make it white and ask you to come back and rate again. Or I could do it differently and hook all of you up to an EEG and see how much you're paying attention to me when the floor is like this versus the floor is white, right? But it's very expensive. It's hard to do. It has to be highly controlled. The context has to be important because I have to give the same talk both times simultaneously. That's not even possible. I give you the talk now, and next time some of you may be more interested, and sometimes other you may be asleep, okay? But which one do I do, the white or the like this right now? Or do I take half of you now and switch it and do half of you later on the other one and see what we get, right? These have to be highly controlled experiments. They're expensive in terms of time. They're certainly robust, but they're limited in the number of details because you all know how many different kind of flooring I could go through to see if there's a difference, okay? So I'm going to give you some of those experiments of the frequentists, and we'll, I think, Carolyn, try to address some of those questions. Back to Manhattan. Okay, this is work Rebecca Liu, I'm just going to acknowledge those that did that, was part of her master's thesis, investigating the influence of streetscape elements on individual preferences. All right, so what we did is we said, what are four key elements of this streetscape / shopping, student-centered shopping area that we'd want to have? Different kinds of parking, seating, green infrastructure, and bike lanes. Now, you all know there are way more variables than that, aren't there? But as I said, doing a very controlled study is really difficult with large number of variables. We came up with a bunch of design alternatives, ran a public survey, and got results, okay? These are the different variations. So within the different elements that I can design, there are different variations of that. So if we look at sidewalk and parking, we just have the existing one. We have a distribution of parking along the way. We only have parking on one side and we don't have any at all. Now, there are also hundreds of different ways I could do parking. 2 spots there, a bulb out, 2 spots there, a bulb out, right? I mean, there's so many different ways of doing this. How do you test all of them? You can't. It's like for design, in the design realm, it's exceedingly difficult. That's why the subjectivist model, that Bayesian, might be helpful, because you take what bits of evidence you get here to help you shift, okay? Green infrastructure, we just said trees, bioswale, and the combination, or none. And we went through this whole list. So developed some different renderings of this to give you an idea. So the top left are sort of some of the iterations. I'm not going to show you all 40 variations, but there were 40 different instantiations of designs that were structured spatially to control where all of these things happened in the same context. We didn't change the spatial location. You can see how that example shifts, okay? All right. We just went through and we did a pilot study to ask what sort of criteria we want to ask for. The 2 that came out to be the most common and distinctive were attractiveness and safety in this particular instance. And went through and had some different valuations. Okay. Now I'm not going to, at this point, I'm not going to show you all the statistics stuff because you've already, it's Friday and I've already, you know, burned your brain anyway. So attractiveness and safety, okay. You can see there are some shifts, but isn't it ironic, 4.84, but that's actually considered, is it more attractive? Might be, but you don't know what the confidence interval is on that and whether or not I actually had a good study participation, okay? They're actually pretty similar. But I bet you wouldn't assume that they're pretty similar if you looked at the design when you're critiquing it, okay? Now, one of the things that we did at the end is that we can go through all the 40 images, collect all the ratings of everybody, and we compare those, and we can pull out these different factors. One of the factor is this green infrastructure, okay? What I'm showing here is what's considered a confidence interval. The idea is these are business members in this orange and the public in blue. We had roughly 35 people that responded to this, 30, 35. And what the confidence interval is telling me is it's likely if I ran the study again and again and again as a frequentist, because I can do this over and over again, that I'm going to end up with an average somewhere between that confidence interval. All right. So the average here could be around here, and this average could be here. They would basically be statistically the same. When you see those bars as distinctively different, you know, you're quite confident that if I ran this study 100 times, at least 95 of them, this is going to be true. I'm pretty confident this is a reality. Now, here's where certain pieces of evidence can be useful. Look at the trajectory of existing to where I just add bioswale. This is regardless of the parking, regardless of the seating, regardless of the bike infrastructure. Just that element. When I add trees only, I get the largest bump in attractiveness. When I have trees and I add the bioswale, there's no fundamental difference in attractiveness. Okay, can we hold to the end? All right. But if I were to ask you before, if I increase those elements, would it actually increase attractiveness? Now, if you believe that that would have increased attractiveness and you're a designer, I want you to point me to the evidence where that is in fact true, where there has been some kind of structured study to demonstrate that. Right? What we have is a lot of designers and experts showing us, oh yeah, this is better. And then we believe that it's better. Well, have you measured that in any empirical way? And if you haven't, then some of it could be conjecture. Yeah. Yeah, it could be something like that. Now, you'd have to have the bioswale in at one point, do visitation in the same season under the same economic conditions, and then remove the bioswale and see if there's any fundamental difference. But we haven't done that. Like we almost never do that. But in a study like this, I might be able to.
The thing that I don't understand is that you haven't defined, so it's like you're giving it very wide. You don't define what attractiveness. So you just ask the question.
Yeah.
But then
we do in the study. I didn't go through all those. Yeah.
It looks like you're defining attractiveness from the results.
Yeah, right. We have a definition of what that means to individuals ahead of time. Yes. Yeah. So that's part of the context. Yeah. Okay. And then we also look at safety. But part of what I'm looking at this is to say, there's limited evidence, like real fundamental, empirically and controlled evidence about the way in which we design. A lot of what we do come from beliefs, assumptions, and theories, and that's great. But we need to be aware that until we empirically evaluate things, we actually don't know if that theory is holding up. All right, another quick study. How am I for time? Where am I at? Be done here soon. Great. Okay. So another study we ran, this is with Tiffany Woods, who is a master's student, graduated recently, a couple years ago, a year and a half ago. And we ran a study with a colleague of mine who's in economics and a colleague of mine who's in environment, natural resources. And we were trying to understand, this is the official title. Okay. The idea is the role in which people really value farmland in peri-urban, so places that are urban adjacent to farmland or nearby, and the role of potentially agrivoltaics. That's the idea of putting solar on farmland. Or you also have wind on farmland, right? So some sort of win-win situation. So what we did is we developed a bunch of different scenarios where, again, we controlled for the kind of agriculture, right? Intensive crops, grazing, cattle, orchards, these kinds of things, and the different types of development. So these are all manufactured from Google Street View. Hannah Green helped with these. Some of you may know Hannah, okay? And we looked at different kinds of development ratios because we know most of these areas are going to be developed into suburban Utah. This is very common, okay? Well, what if we asked people in that region and said, if you could levy a tax, whatever tax you'd prefer, sales tax, property tax, some other kind of tax, and you could tax yourself to preserve the agriculture in your area, to what extent would you do that? Okay, we can certainly ask people, do you like agriculture? Why do you like it? There's a whole lot of other studies and data behind this, but I just give you some idea. So we varied preservation by 0, 50, and 100%. Now, obviously, we can get a whole range of those, but it was easy in the image to show 0% because it's all developed, 50% only one side, and 100% it's all farm, okay? And we wanted to do that through a visual instead of just text. One of the great things that you all have, the power that you have, is to create visuals to represent future scenarios. That is so mind-bogglingly important nowadays, to be able to give people a future, okay? We asked whether solar was on it or not, and we had different tax incentives, $200, $100, 50, 25, 10, and 0, okay? And so all these different scenarios came up. And what you would do is you would get a whole range of these. So you'd see 6 different variations, and you would select the choice that you made. It's called discrete choice modeling. You would select the choice amongst those 3. And then we get to run some magical statistics. I have to thank my colleague, Arthur Kaplan, for taking this on. And we get some basic results, okay? There's a whole litany of them. But in short, people prefer some sort of diverse array of development toward preservation, okay? We probably know that. People prefer that. But now we're saying we want to put a little dollars to it. Now, this is willingness to pay is the term. How much would you be willing to pay? Well, are you actually paying for it now? Willingness to pay can be a challenge methodologically, but it's one of the options that we have. What we're seeing here is that on average, across the, what do we have, 90 or so participants from these, it was Layton and Spanish Fork residents, people would be willing to levy themselves $180 tax to preserve farmland as it is. So now we'd have to go through and say, how many people are in that area? And if we actually could levy that tax, good luck politically, but if we could levy that tax, could that actually subsidize the farmland and keep it? It might. If you've got 10,000 households, that's a good amount of money for a subsidy, right? If that farmland has agrivoltaics, people were less willing. Now, on the other hand, if they've got land, they're actually producing money because of agrivoltaics. But this is sort of a context. Before that, how many of you would be able to put a number on it and say, could we actually do this, right? Now we have some useful piece, a point of reference that we can say, this is where I believe we're, now I have a point of reference. Does that shift me anywhere, right? That's the benefit of having evidence. It doesn't say this is truth per se.
They did it in Boulder.
Yeah, they did. Exactly. Okay. All right. This is going to hit a little more home. Okay. So Phil Phil, who's here, is a PhD student, and Corinne is up here, have been working on this project. What we ended up doing, so Phil's really interested in, and sort of like the elements and criteria that go into making good design, and particularly conveying awards and ASLA. What kind of elements go into making a good submission? All right. So poor Corinne has scraped over 13,000 images and annotated every single one for a range of different criteria over the last months of time. We'll present more of this next semester in more detail. If you're interested, December 9th, you're giving a little poster presentation at the undergrad research symposium, okay? Okay, we might send that out to the student thing, just advertise. Okay, so all the images for all the awards were downloaded and she annotated those, okay? Just to give you a little glimpse of this, the words you see on here are just some of the criteria that we developed for the kinds of images that were being represented in this. Okay, this is the first pass. All right, so precedent images, hand and sketch graphics, right, over to rendered perspectives, projects that have been completed, different types of analyses of sorts, right? Okay, this is the ratio of submissions from 2005 to 2020 of the number of images. So if this constitutes the range of images I'm going to submit, this gives me a proportion, a relative proportion on average of what's being submitted for ASLA awards. Does that help you consider how you might approach what you're doing? Okay. Or at least it gives you knowledge of there's convention. Should I do something different? But now you have new evidence that you never had before to make a different decision, to be more strategic about what you're doing. Here's sort of the timeline as those images have changed. So the darker is representing 2020, the lighter is 2005. And you can see they actually follow similar patterns. There's been some oscillation within map inlay and analyses. Okay. Obviously, there are lots of multi-images things stitched together of different sorts. Okay, so you could also look at these data and say trajectories. We noticed some things in 2011 and 13 where there were some distinct anomalies. That could have been because of the adjudication committee. Okay, so it's helpful to use evidence to understand who is my audience and what are they looking for. This looks at the scale of the images, the elements. So when I have an image, what's the sort of scale? Is it a large scale that I'm looking at? I should say small scale, large context. I say it that way, right? So a whole city would be large, and an element would be this little piece here. Look at this consistency through time. Student awards across all award levels are overwhelmingly submitting a disproportionate number of images that show a large context. Understand what you do in a large context. Okay, yeah.
How does this differ from submissions that we now? We don't have
Don't know. You're right. It could have been all the same, and then at that point, it would have just at least been quality. So here you are. How is it different with my model? But does this give me anything new that I now know that I didn't before? So yes, great point. Great evidence. I'd like to know that. I don't know if we will. Okay, so a couple take-homes. All right, to go back to foundations. So we have bias in interpretation and the way we inference. There's this thing called conjunction fallacy. That's the Linda question. Okay, that's the Main Street is beautiful and with trees. It can be beautiful without trees. Both are still true, just to say it's beautiful. The simple model is often the most true, the simpler approach, okay? But there's no excuse for doing the work just because to make it simple. You still have to do hard work. Remember that most of what we process and do is in system one. We do not want to do hard work, cognitive work. So when we think a simple model, think of how simple an Olympic ice skater makes it look. It looks simple, but there is a lot of hard work inside that. Okay? Aim for accuracy, continue to revise. And then the cognitive strain thing we've talked about, okay? In terms of probability, as we become critical thinkers, creative designers, my recommendation is our beliefs and inferences benefit by continuous updates of these small bits of information. You are already doing that, but do it intentionally, do it rationally, Do it with cognitive dissonance, meaning I don't believe this, but I'm going to try to understand it because it might change my perspective and understanding of who I am or what I am as a designer. Okay. Adam Grant's Think Again book really goes through that. It's fantastic if you're interested in understanding that. Okay. Recognizing the limits in the approach to new evidence. Okay. This subjective versus objective approach. I gave you some examples that were more objective, but they're very limited in the range of design elements that I included, right? So it might just give you some idea or context, but it's probably one of the first things that you've seen with bioswales and trees. Okay. Design projects are extremely difficult. We talked about that several times to run this fundamentals perspective. Okay. When you see experiments that are systematic, comprehensive and systematic, that evidence can be quite robust, but be aware if it's bad evidence or done poorly. Be aware of that because it might shift your perspective in opposite way of what good design might be. Okay. Empirical evidence can provide that reliable information, but you have to understand how to interpret it. So when I see averages of ratings and there's no context within a confidence interval to say, actually, they're the same, I might misinterpret that data, the illusion of validity. How I understand the pattern of information might actually be incorrect. Okay. All right. There we go. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, I'll turn off.
Thank you so much, Brent. One quick thing I should mention, we're going to do a quick Q&A, but there is also a reception after this. I forgot to mention upstairs in the common studio, we'll have some refreshments and snacks up there. But I'd like to open the floor to a few questions if anyone has any. Yeah.
Excellent. Brent, I'm just wondering why on your attractiveness model you did a 1 to 7 number instead of a 1 to 10. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, the question is, why did we have a 1 to 7 versus a 1 to 10? 1 to 10 is really common. 1 to 7 is another scale that's often used. It also it allows people to vote in a neutral way, which is sometimes considered a little safer. But here's the thing. There are a number of papers that use those models, but very little that comprehensively compare a rating mechanism. One of them is coming out. Okay. 1 to 5, 1 to 7, 1 to 9, 1 to 10 are often used. That's what we chose. There's a little other details behind it, but yeah. It's large enough to get a stretch. 1 to 5 probably wouldn't have shown enough variation, but doing a 1 to 10 is often cognitively like a little more than what we actually needed for a quick response. That's the short. Yep.
First, thank you. This is a really interesting presentation. I'm from the sociology department, so I had no idea people over here were talking about things like this, and I think it's great. I just love to know what you think about causal inference literature these days, and how, or what type of data might you use to look at changes in the built environment and compare that to like nationally representative, like census data, ACS data. That way you could make really broad scale inferential claims about the value of the changes that were put in the environment.
So when we talk about like causal kind of ideas, we're trying to understand what sort of phenomena causes a particular outcome, right? Or what sort of independent variables, what sort of factors create whatever outcome might exist. Okay, so thinking about the American Community Survey data set, which is sort of a census data, you get year 1, 3, and 5, right? It's more detailed than broad census. Trying to understand factors of built environment. So we are actually running some research right now on that with people with disabilities. Trying to understand the context of where do people live? What is their sort of the demographic context, limitations, challenges, otherwise that are faced as a result of built environment. So there's, Minnie is working on this right now. So there's things like what kind of facilities exist, right? So grocery stores and restaurants, these sort of things. How does that connect with a measure of social satisfaction? for instance, right? So we can look at the configuration of different kinds of facilities, the number of facilities, the proximity of those facilities, as well as, yeah, you can pull up things like crime or how many trees are in the area or what kind of parks are in the space, that sort of thing. And so you draw, basically you create regression models between those different spatial factors of design and the outcome that could be, is it median income? Is it some sort of health metric? Is it something else? Is it land value, right? And so there's a difference between causation and correlation, and we don't necessarily always know what that is, but those things happen quite a lot. Actually, we're like certainly really interested in how the spatial layout of things at planning scales are influenced by or influence different demographical changes. Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for coming. Off.
We're going to take one more, and so we can get up to the reception. But if you have any further questions, Brent will be up there and you can talk to him one-on-one if you'd like.
When we were looking at the triangle park with the 4 designs, I was looking at them and I thought they were all great. And I had this passing thought, like, who cares? Or like, they're all really good. So like, sorry, essentially it just led me to think like, do you have a way to measure whether or not it's worth it, or like to go through all this? Like, is it, my first thought is just scale, like, you know, but I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, so a couple notions. This was because I don't have any like designs myself to show you, and I didn't take time to sketch a bunch of things out because it would not have been good precedent for you to learn. Say, this is what a professor does. I couldn't show you what ugly and good are. These were several designs by a firm that says these are legitimate opportunities. So I'm not saying that any one of these is distinctively better or worse than the other. It was there as an example to say, let's come up with several different models, several different concepts, and we can use different forms to evaluate those. So that's just as context. But the other thing you're wondering was actually a section of the talk, but I knew it was already going to go the length that it did, was actually talking about trade-off space. So there's always a question as we're learning probabilistically and shifting based on new evidence. The question is, how much time do we have to get all this evidence? I mean, I've been a faculty member for a while, and these studies take a long time to get these little bits of information. The amount of time that it takes to get the information versus the quality in which, or the shift in which that creates for me as a designer is really fundamentally difficult. We always want to do that, right? So the thing is, if we know that we come up with 4 really good designs, but that took a year to do, you probably just lost profit. The idea, and you can think of profit right now as a student of how much time you have available in your life to be doing this stuff. How quickly can I iterate through designs to get me something accurate? So we're like, here's the accurate, and the other 8 renditions that come from that are probably going to be somewhat similar. Okay. But it might be better to say, I'm going to just show like this kind of concept that's different, this one that's different, this one's different, take some quick approaches, look at them very quickly and say, where do I think I'm seeing with these? Drop these other ones, focus on this. Okay. Because you always have a trade-off between the amount of effort and time that you spend on something and the quality with which that's done. So I don't know how long it took, but absolutely, I think likely in this, they may not be profoundly different enough. It might be something where they sort of settled on a concept and said, now let's make variations instead of concept 1 with these variations and some other different concept with 4 others that's fundamentally different. Yeah. Okay.
But to build on, since Randy asked the question.
Yeah.
And it relates to what Carolyn was talking about. And I'm a pragmatist, okay? Because I would look at this and I geek out on it.
Yeah.
The thing that I always want to know about these, how many people will visit A, B, C, D, and how long will they stay?
Yeah.
Why can't people focus on stuff like that, which is really useful for practice? And that's a really useful set of answers to those.
Exactly. And actually, like to the point of criteria, and then your question of the trade-off is saying, all the things that I introduced early on were numbers that had objective sorts of measures that I could quiz you on or test you on, right? And what Todd's sort of bringing up is this notion of how are we evaluating the performance of what we're doing? Like, why does attractiveness of the streetscape fundamentally matter? Are people spending more money there commercially? Is it creating some sort of community social hub? Is it providing some safe place for people? And then how do we measure those things? That's additional empirical data that we can get from any design to say, I built this, we designed the streetscape and we did it in this way, and here was the outcome from before and after. Therefore, I have better knowledge objectively to make an argument for why we could also do that over here, because I spent the time in the background to say the contexts are similar, and I now have evidence to suggest this particular reason. But we often don't gather enough performance metrics to be able to conduct that kind of empirical analysis of space. So it is worth something being built into what we're doing as designer.
We gathered that on the streets, and we got a speed gun, a temperature meter, a decimal meter, and we went to streetscapes before and after, and we took the speed gun and we correlated that with
perfect
shopkeepers or people interviewed at restaurants wanted.
Yep.
And we started to put that data.
And now what we want to do is say, is that data available to other people to say, this is where we're seeing as things that are fundamentally different. There is a wealth of information we need to get to improve the empiricism of how we're doing design. And I just want to say, as that increases, remember those potential biases that we are subject to when we're reviewing information and making inferences about that. Yes. Awesome. Thank you all for coming.